The rope that held the rope stretched taut against the cliff edge like a prayer made visible, its frayed strands catching the last light of a rain-soaked afternoon on Hacksaw Ridge. Desmond Doss ran his fingers along the manila fibers, testing each section while artillery rumbled in the distance. 21 men had already made this descent into the gathering dusk, lowered one by one through 60 feet of empty air, while Japanese machine guns swept the plateau above. Now, in the failing light of another brutal day on Okinawa, the rope told its own story through broken threads and blood-dark stains. The 77th Infantry Division had taken the ridge that morning, or thought they had, until the counterattack came screaming out of the cave systems like something from a nightmare. Within minutes, half the company lay scattered across the muddy plateau, some calling for their mothers, others silent in the growing shadows. The survivors had rappelled down in panicked clusters, leaving their wounded behind, according to orders that made sense everywhere except in the place where men lay bleeding. "We're pulling back, Doss," Staff Sergeant Howell had said, still picking shrapnel from his forearm. "Ridge is lost, wounded are gone, and any fool who goes back up there won't be coming down again." But Desmond had listened to those orders while cleaning blood from his aid bag, his mind already calculating the supplies he'd need for what everyone else called impossible. The other medics shook their heads as they watched him check his rope, knowing that the plateau above remained a killing field, swept by crossfire from 3 directions. Even if someone could reach the wounded, lowering them down the cliff would require equipment they didn't possess and daylight they couldn't afford. "Take this," Howell had urged, pointing to a captured Thompson submachine gun lying nearby. "You go up there with just bandages, you're dead in 5 minutes. That SMG might keep you breathing long enough to help somebody." Desmond had stared at the weapon for a long moment, feeling the weight of expectation from every soldier around him. The Thompson represented everything logical about warfare, the ability to fight back, to suppress enemy fire, to survive through superior firepower. His fingers had actually reached toward the gun before he pulled them back, shaking his head quietly. "I can't," he whispered, "but I can still help them." The other men had watched in disbelief as he shouldered his aid bag and began climbing back up the cliff face, carrying nothing but medical supplies and this length of rope scavenged from a destroyed supply drop. Now, hours later, the rope had become something else entirely, a lifeline connecting the possible to the impossible, the living to the dying, faith to the brutal mathematics of war. Private Coleman, conscious during his descent earlier that afternoon, had gripped the rope with white knuckles as Desmond lowered him inch by inch down the cliff face. "Why?" Coleman had gasped through his pain. "Why come back for us?" Desmond had no easy answer then, and none now as he prepared for what might be his final trip across the plateau. Faith seemed too simple, duty too abstract. He only knew that each man's voice calling for help created a weight in his chest that wouldn't lift until he responded. The rope trembled in his hands as he fed it through the improvised pulley system, and he found himself bargaining with God, just hold together for one more man, just one more. Henderson still lay unconscious near the ridge's center, a head wound slowly bleeding through makeshift bandages. Behind him, Japanese voices echoed from the cave systems, suggesting preparation for a night assault that would eliminate any remaining Americans. The rope, examined by touch in the gathering darkness, resembled a twisted collection of individual strands, held together more by divine intervention than structural integrity. As enemy flares suddenly illuminated the entire ridge in harsh white light, Desmond pressed himself flat against the muddy ground, feeling machine gun fire chew apart the earth around him. For precious minutes, he lay motionless as the flares drifted earthward on small parachutes, turning night into deadly noon. When darkness returned, he whispered a prayer, shouldered Henderson's limp weight, and began the long crawl back to the cliff edge where the rope waited, frayed, blood-stained, and somehow still holding. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation, and stay with us for the next chapters. The first wounded man Desmond had reached that morning was Corporal Martinez, gut-shot and delirious with fever. Martinez had been conscious enough to grab Desmond's sleeve as sniper bullets whined overhead, his eyes wide with the particular terror of a man who knows he's been forgotten. "They left us," Martinez had whispered. "Whole damn company just left us up here to die." Desmond had worked to stabilize the abdominal wound while dragging Martinez behind the cover of a shattered tree stump, the same blackened trunk that now served as his landmark in the darkness. The evacuation point lay 50 yards away across open ground, a journey that might as well have been 50 miles, with Japanese machine guns covering every approach. With no suppressing fire to cover his movement, Desmond had learned to time each dash between the irregular patterns of enemy fire, pulling wounded men foot by foot toward the cliff edge while whispering prayers under his breath. Lieutenant Barnes had watched that first rescue through binoculars from the relative safety of the company's new position below the ridge. Even now, hours later, Barnes found himself unable to reconcile what he'd observed with everything he'd been taught about tactics, survival, and the brutal mathematics of acceptable losses on Okinawa. "One man," Barnes muttered to his radio operator as they monitored reports from other sectors of the 77th Infantry Division's advance. "One unarmed medic doing what a full platoon with covering fire couldn't accomplish." The radio crackled with updates from neighboring units. More caves discovered, more casualties, more ridgelines that looked secure until the enemy emerged from positions no one had suspected. Hacksaw Ridge was just one bloody landmark in a campaign that had already consumed thousands of American lives. But something about the lone figure moving across that plateau defied every lesson Barnes had learned about what men could endure. Through the scope of his rifle, Private Jackson had watched Desmond's improvised pulley system lower Martinez into the waiting hands of stretcher-bearers below. Jackson had served with medics before, respected their courage, even envied their clarity of purpose. But this was different. This was a man who'd refused to carry a weapon, making repeated trips into a space that had broken the spirit of armed soldiers. "Crazy bastard's going to get himself killed," Jackson whispered to his foxhole partner, "and probably get more of us killed trying to recover his body." But as the afternoon wore on, and more wounded descended that rope, Private Coleman with his shattered leg, Sergeant Williams with burns across his back, Corporal Hayes unconscious from blood loss, Jackson's resentment had slowly transformed into something approaching awe. Each successful rescue seemed to mock his own limitations, his acceptance of what was possible versus what was necessary. The rope had developed a rhythm of its own, stretching and relaxing as each wounded man descended. Desmond had fashioned the anchor point from twisted metal and debris, testing it obsessively between each trip across the plateau. The manila fibers showed increasing wear, individual strands snapping under the accumulated weight of desperate men being lowered into the gathering dusk. At the aid station below, Dr. Morrison worked with increasing urgency as stretcher after stretcher arrived from the cliff face. Morrison had seen enough battlefield medicine to recognize impossible situations, and what was happening above the ridge qualified as impossible by every reasonable standard. Yet the wounded kept coming, each one a testament to one medic's refusal to accept mathematical reality. "How many more up there?" Morrison asked as he cleaned shrapnel from Coleman's leg. "Don't know, sir," Coleman replied through gritted teeth. "But that medic, he keeps going back. Says he's looking for just one more." Morrison had heard those words before, the dangerous phrase that kept good soldiers moving long past the point where movement became suicide. But just one more, spoken by an unarmed man in a place where armed men had failed, carried a different weight, implied a different kind of mathematics entirely. As night settled over Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond checked his remaining supplies. 3 morphine syrettes, a handful of bandages, and the growing certainty that Henderson represented his last chance to bring someone home alive. The rope waited at the cliff edge, its frayed condition visible even in the darkness. 20 men had trusted their lives to those manila strands. 20 men now breathed because the rope had held when physics suggested it should have failed. The weight of Henderson's unconscious form pressed against Desmond's shoulders as he made his final approach to the evacuation point. Enemy voices growing louder from the cave systems behind him. The rope stretched before him in the darkness, and he found himself wondering which would break first, the fibers, his faith, or his body's ability to keep moving forward when every instinct screamed for him to stop. The morning had started with intelligence reports suggesting light resistance on Hacksaw Ridge, but intelligence rarely accounted for the kind of maze the Japanese had carved into the coral and rock of Okinawa. Lieutenant Barnes had studied the aerial photographs during the pre-dawn briefing, noting what appeared to be simple defensive positions along the ridgeline. The reality had proven devastatingly different. "Whole damn place is honeycombed with tunnels," Barnes reported over the radio as his men regrouped in the muddy depression below the cliff. "They're not just dug in up there, they're living in the rock itself." The 77th Infantry Division's advance across Okinawa had encountered this pattern repeatedly. Positions that looked manageable from a distance revealed themselves as killing grounds once American forces committed to the assault. Hacksaw Ridge represented the latest in a series of bloody lessons about Japanese defensive capabilities, but it was becoming something else as well. A demonstration of what one man's conscience could accomplish in a place where conventional courage had failed. Private Jackson cleaned his rifle while watching the rope sway in the wind above them, each movement a reminder of the impossible mathematics being worked out on the plateau. Jackson had grown up in rural Alabama, where practical men solved practical problems with practical tools. A rifle was a practical tool. A bayonet was a practical tool. Prayer and medical supplies were fine in their place, but their place wasn't on a ridge swept by machine gun fire. "Makes the rest of us look like cowards," Jackson muttered to his foxhole partner, Corporal Williams. Not the wounded sergeant, but another Williams from a different company. "What am I supposed to tell my family after the war? That I carried a rifle and stayed down here while some conscientious objector did the real fighting?" But Williams had been watching the rope too, counting the wounded as they descended, calculating the odds against each successful rescue. The arithmetic was simple enough. 21 men had been lowered to safety, and by all reasonable expectations, 21 men should have died on the plateau, along with their unarmed rescuer. "Maybe we're asking the wrong question," Williams suggested quietly. "Maybe it's not about cowards and heroes. Maybe it's about what happens when someone decides the rules don't apply." The aid station had transformed into controlled chaos as Dr. Morrison and his team processed the steady stream of casualties from the ridge. Morrison had learned to read the rhythm of battlefield medicine, the ebb and flow of wounded, the pauses that meant either victory or total defeat, the sudden rushes that indicated disaster. What was happening at Hacksaw Ridge followed no rhythm he recognized. "Medic's been up there for 6 hours," reported the chief petty officer monitoring the evacuation point. "Lost count of how many trips he's made across that plateau. Rope's starting to look like string, but he keeps sending them down." Morrison had treated enough rope burns and exhaustion cases to understand what sustained movement under fire costs the human body. The medic working the ridge had to be running on reserves that shouldn't exist, motivated by something beyond normal human endurance. Each wounded man who arrived carried the same story. One unarmed soldier moving through enemy fire as if the bullets had agreed to miss him. At division headquarters, reports of the Hacksaw Ridge situation competed with updates from a dozen other bloody sectors. Okinawa was consuming American lives at a rate that made even hardened commanders pause, but individual acts of heroism rarely warranted attention at the operational level. The 77th Infantry Division's forward observers had noted the unusual evacuation method, wounded being lowered by rope rather than carried to rear assembly areas. But the strategic picture demanded focus on larger objectives. Yet something about the Hacksaw Ridge reports troubled Colonel Hayes as he reviewed casualty figures that made no sense. His division had taken the ridge, lost it, written off the wounded, then somehow recovered all casualties without losing the rescue force. The after-action reports would need explanation, but first they needed completion. "How many wounded still up there?" Hayes asked his operations officer. "Best estimate is 1, sir." Medics making his final run. Hayes found himself staring at the tactical map, trying to reconcile the morning's disaster with the evening's impossible recovery. 21 casualties evacuated from an untenable position by one unarmed medic challenged every assumption about what was possible in warfare. It suggested that courage might operate according to different rules than tactics, that faith might accomplish what firepower could not. As Henderson's unconscious weight pressed against Desmond's shoulders during that final approach to the cliff edge, the rope waited in the darkness like a prayer made tangible. The manila fibers had stretched beyond their rated capacity, held weights they were never designed to bear, and somehow maintained their grip on life itself. 21 men breathed, because mathematics had yielded to something larger, because one medic had refused to accept the arithmetic of acceptable losses. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. Henderson's dead weight against Desmond's back felt like carrying the accumulated exhaustion of every rescue that had come before. The unconscious private had taken shrapnel to the head during the morning's counterattack, and his steady breathing was the only indication that the long wait on the plateau hadn't claimed another life. Desmond dragged him foot by foot through the mud, timing each movement to the irregular patterns of enemy fire that still swept the ridge in the darkness. The rope lay coiled beside the improvised anchor point, like a serpent that had swallowed more than it should survive. In the last light of dusk, Desmond could see individual strands that had snapped under the accumulated stress of 20 previous descents. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. Each rescue had weakened the rope, and Henderson might be the weight that finally broke their shared lifeline to the world below Hacksaw Ridge. Please," Desmond whispered as he secured the rope around Henderson's chest. "Just one more. Just let it hold for one more." The prayer wasn't directed at the rope, though the manila fibers had taken on an almost sacred quality during the long afternoon of impossible rescues. It was directed at whatever force had kept him moving through the crossfire while armed men had fallen, whatever mathematics governed miracles in a place where conventional courage had failed. From his position below the cliff, Lieutenant Barnes watched through binoculars as a dark figure moved against the skyline above. Barnes had stopped trying to reconcile what he was observing with his training in tactics and probability. A full platoon with supporting fire had been driven off that ridge in minutes. One unarmed medic had spent the entire afternoon moving across the same ground as if enemy bullets had agreed to miss him. "Last man coming down," Barnes reported over the radio to division headquarters. "Medic's been up there since 0800. Lost count of how many trips he made across that plateau." The rope stretched taut as Henderson began his descent, and Barnes found himself holding his breath despite the tactical radio chatter demanding his attention. 21 wounded Americans hung in the balance of manila fibers that should have snapped hours ago. Testament to what happened when someone decided that impossible meant nothing when men were dying. Private Jackson had cleaned his rifle 3 times while watching the evacuations, each successful rescue making him feel smaller. Jackson carried an M1 Garand, knew how to use it, trusted its ability to keep him alive in a firefight. But what use was a rifle against the kind of courage that walked unarmed into enemy fire? What was the practical value of weapons when the most important work was being done by a man who refused to carry one? 22 men, Jackson counted as Henderson disappeared into the darkness below. 22 men, saved by a medic who won't fight back. The mathematics of it challenged everything Jackson had been taught about warfare and survival. The army had spent months training him to kill efficiently, to suppress enemy fire with superior firepower, to survive through aggressive violence. One conscientious objector with a rope and a first aid kit had accomplished what Jackson's entire squad, with full combat loads, could not. At the aid station, Dr. Morrison caught Henderson as he reached the bottom, immediately checking pupils and pulse while orderlies prepared a stretcher. Morrison had seen enough head wounds to recognize the difference between survivable trauma and lost causes. Henderson would live, would probably recover completely, because someone had refused to write him off as an acceptable loss. "How many is that?" Morrison asked as he cleaned the head wound. 22, sir," reported the chief petty officer. "Medic's still up there." Morrison had stopped questioning the impossible hours ago. The medic working Hacksaw Ridge operated according to rules that Morrison's medical training hadn't covered, sustained by something beyond normal human endurance. Each wounded man told the same story. One unarmed soldier moving through crossfire as if the enemy had agreed to let him pass. The rope hung slack against the cliff face as Desmond prepared for his own descent, every fiber visible in the darkness like a diagram of accumulated stress. The anchor point held, fashioned from debris and determination, testament to what improvisation could accomplish when conventional equipment failed. 22 men had trusted their lives to this system, and 22 men now breathed because mathematics had yielded to something larger. But as Desmond secured the rope around his own waist for the final descent, Japanese voices grew louder from the cave systems behind him. The enemy was moving, preparing for the night assault that would retake the ridge and eliminate any remaining Americans. The plateau that had sheltered him during the long afternoon of rescues was about to become a killing ground once more. The rope trembled as Desmond began his descent, each fiber stretched beyond its rated capacity, held together by forces that engineering manuals couldn't quantify. Below him, the 77th Infantry Division survivors waited in the darkness, knowing that 22 lives had been saved by a man who proved that courage operated according to different mathematics than tactics, that faith could accomplish what firepower could not. What the citation would never capture was the moment of pure terror, when Desmond had first looked over the cliff edge that morning, seeing 60 feet of empty air, and knowing that everything, every life he might save, depended on manila rope that was already frayed from its previous use in supply operations. The official report would describe extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, but it wouldn't mention the way his hands had shaken as he tested the anchor point, or the small prayers he whispered with each knot. The secret that Desmond would carry for the rest of his life wasn't about courage. It was about the moment during Martinez's rescue when the rope had actually snapped. For 3 terrifying seconds, Martinez had fallen freely before the remaining strands caught his weight with a jerk that nearly tore the anchor point loose. Desmond had felt the rope give way, had seen Martinez's face as gravity claimed him, had experienced the specific helplessness of watching someone fall because his improvised system had failed. But somehow, impossibly, the rope had held. Enough fibers remained intact to arrest Martinez's fall and complete the descent, though the experience left both men shaking. Martinez never mentioned those 3 seconds of freefall in his debriefing, and Desmond never reported the equipment failure that should have killed them both. Some things were too fragile to examine too closely, even in official reports. "Rope broke," Desmond had whispered to himself as he pulled the line back up for inspection. "Actually broke, and somehow we're both still alive." The realization should have ended his rescue efforts immediately. Standard operating procedure demanded that he report the equipment failure and await replacement gear that everyone knew wouldn't come. But 20 men still lay wounded on the plateau, and Desmond found himself testing the remaining strands, calculating whether they might hold for just one more rescue, then one more after that. Lieutenant Barnes would remember this night differently as years passed. In 1965, speaking to a high school assembly about his war experiences, Barnes would describe the Hacksaw Ridge evacuation as a textbook example of battlefield initiative and improvisational leadership. He would mention the rope only in passing, focusing instead on tactical lessons and the importance of never leaving wounded behind. But in 1947, 2 years after the war, Barnes had awakened from nightmares about manila fibers snapping in the darkness, about the sound-wounded men would have made falling 60 feet onto coral rock. The dreams always ended the same way, with Barnes himself trying to climb the rope to help, only to watch it disintegrate in his hands as enemy fire erupted from the caves above. The other medics in the 77th Infantry Division had understood something that the official reports couldn't acknowledge. What Desmond accomplished on Hacksaw Ridge wasn't repeatable, wasn't tactical doctrine that could be taught to other soldiers. It was one man's refusal to accept the mathematics of acceptable losses, sustained by faith that operated outside normal human limitations. Corporal Martinez, recovering from his abdominal wound at a field hospital 3 weeks later, found himself unable to explain to visitors what the rescue had actually felt like. How could he describe those 3 seconds of freefall, the certainty of death, then the impossible reprieve when the rope caught his weight? How could he make them understand that his survival depended on equipment that had technically failed, held together by forces that engineering manuals couldn't quantify? "Medics saved my life," Martinez would tell people, and leave it at that. The truth was more complicated. Martinez had been saved by a man who'd continued working with broken equipment, who'd somehow made 21 additional rescues using rope that should have failed during the first attempt. Faith might explain Desmond's courage, but it couldn't explain the physics that had kept manila fibers together long past their structural limits. Private Jackson, cleaning his rifle in the darkness below the ridge, had watched each descent with growing bewilderment. Jackson understood mechanical systems, knew how rope behaved under stress, could calculate load-bearing capacity for climbing equipment. What he'd observed that afternoon violated every principle of material science he'd learned during his civilian job at a construction company. "Rope should have killed them all," Jackson muttered to himself as Henderson completed the final descent. "Should have snapped after the first couple of rescues." How the hell did it hold 22 men? The question would haunt Jackson for decades. In 1987, working as a safety inspector at a rope manufacturing plant, he would find himself testing manila fibers and remembering that impossible afternoon on Okinawa. The mathematics never changed. The rope that held 22 lives on Hacksaw Ridge should have failed catastrophically after the 3rd or 4th rescue. But 22 men had breathed because mathematics had yielded to something larger. As Desmond made his own final descent in the darkness, feeling the rope stretch and tremble under his weight, he whispered one last prayer of gratitude. Not for his own survival, though that seemed miraculous enough, but for the manila fibers that had somehow held when logic demanded they break. 22 men would see their families again because rope had behaved like faith made tangible. The secret he would never share was simple. The equipment had failed, but the mission had succeeded. Faith had asked him to keep moving when practical considerations demanded he stop, and somehow the physical world had accommodated the impossible. 47 years later, Desmond Doss would sit in a veterans' hospital room in Alabama, watching rain streak the windows while a documentary crew adjusted their cameras and microphones. The interviewer, a young woman who had never heard artillery fire, would ask him about the rope, whether he'd ever doubted it would hold, whether fear had ever made him consider stopping the rescues before all 22 men reached safety. Desmond would be quiet for a long moment, his hands, now marked by arthritis and age spots, unconsciously rubbing together as if testing fibers that existed only in memory. The smell of rain on the window would bring back the particular scent of wet manila rope, and he would be 23 years old again, lowering Henderson into the darkness while Japanese voices grew louder behind him. "The rope held," he would finally tell the camera. That's what mattered. 22 men went home to their families because the rope held when it should have broken. But what he wouldn't mention was the way his hands still trembled sometimes when he handled rope, garden line, clothesline, even the soft cotton cord on bathrobes. His wife had noticed it over the years, how he would pause when tying knots, testing them obsessively as if lives still depended on their strength. Some things were too deep to explain, even to people who loved him. The documentary would air in 1992, part of a series about Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. Millions of viewers would see an elderly man describing impossible courage with quiet humility, would hear about faith-sustaining hope when conventional wisdom demanded despair. The rope would be mentioned as a detail, interesting but secondary to the larger story of heroism and divine providence. Private Jackson, by then a retired safety inspector living in Birmingham, would watch the documentary in his den while his grandson played video games on the floor. When Desmond mentioned the rope, Jackson would lean forward, remembering manila fibers that had somehow held 22 lives when physics suggested they should have failed. The old questions would resurface. How had the rope held? What force beyond engineering had kept those fibers together? "Grandpa," his grandson would ask during a commercial break, "did you really know that guy?" Jackson would be quiet for a moment, remembering a muddy night on Okinawa when mathematics had yielded to something larger. "I was there," he'd finally answer. "Saw the whole thing. Still don't understand how any of us lived through it." Lieutenant Barnes, by then a retired businessman in Atlanta, would miss the documentary entirely, but he would dream about it that same night, one of the recurring dreams that had visited him since 1945. In the dream, he would be climbing the rope himself, trying to reach the plateau to help with the rescues, only to feel the fibers give way beneath his hands. He would wake up, as always, with the sound of his own voice calling "medic" in the darkness. The official records, preserved in the National Archives, would tell a cleaner version of the story. After-action reports would describe tactical objectives, casualty figures, and equipment usage. The rope would be listed in supply manifests. One length, manila, quarter-inch diameter, procured from destroyed supply drops and employed in medical evacuation operations. No mention of the 3 seconds when Martinez fell, no acknowledgement that the equipment had technically failed while somehow succeeding. Dr. Morrison, retired from his surgical practice in Chicago, would keep a different kind of record. In his desk drawer lay a small notebook where he'd written the names of every wounded man who'd reached his aid station that night. 22 names, each representing someone who'd lived because one medic had refused to accept the arithmetic of acceptable losses. Morrison would read the list sometimes, remembering hands that had cleaned wounds and steadied stretchers in the darkness below Hacksaw Ridge. At the Okinawan Peace Memorial, visitors from around the world would read plaques describing the battle for Hacksaw Ridge. The displays would mention American courage and Japanese resistance, would note casualty figures and strategic objectives. A single photograph would show the cliff face where the rescues had occurred, though the anchor point Desmond had fashioned from debris had long since been removed by weather and time. But sometimes tour guides would tell visitors about the rope, about manila fibers that had held when logic demanded they break, about one man's refusal to leave wounded behind, even when conventional wisdom declared the situation hopeless. The story would be simplified for public consumption, reduced to manageable lessons about courage and faith, but the essential truth would remain. 22 men had lived because someone had decided that impossible meant nothing when lives were at stake. In Desmond's final years, when arthritis made it difficult to grip objects firmly, he would still test knots with careful attention to their strength and security. His children learned not to ask about the habit, understanding that some wartime experiences remained too private for explanation. But they would notice how he paused sometimes when tying shoelaces or securing packages, his fingers moving as if they remembered the weight of other lives depending on the integrity of fiber and faith. The rope itself had been lost to history, discarded as damaged equipment after the war, or simply worn away by decades of weather on the ridge. But its legacy lived on in 22 families who had welcomed sons home instead of receiving folded flags, in grandchildren who existed because manila fibers had somehow held when mathematics suggested they should have failed. On quiet nights in the Veterans Hospital, Desmond would sometimes smell rain on windows and remember the weight of Henderson's unconscious form against his shoulders, the trembling of overloaded rope in the darkness, the impossible mathematics of survival in a place where men were supposed to die. The legend the world knew was true as far as it went, but the real story lived in the memory of hands that had tested fibers and found them strong enough, somehow, to hold on to life itself. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.